Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex topics and, well, we try to break them down, helping you get informed quickly and thoroughly. Today, we're really embarking on a deep dive into the historical threads, the ones that have shaped the post-Soviet landscape. We're particularly focusing on Ukraine and the broader conflict with the West.
It's definitely an essential exploration. I mean, these historical processes are absolutely crucial for understanding what's happening right now.
Exactly. We'll be pulling back the curtain on the why behind the headlines, maybe uncovering some surprising facts, and exploring how events that might seem disconnected are actually, deeply intertwined.
Yeah, connecting the dots between past events and current geopolitical realities. We'll examine the origins of today's conflicts, maybe challenge some common narratives along the way.
Our mission really is to give you a powerful shortcut to being well-informed on this, let's face it, critical subject. Okay, let's unpack this.
The seeds of disunion tracing the roots of post-Soviet conflict.
Often, when we look at history, we search for that single defining moment, a specific year that marks the beginning of these huge shifts.
Right, like a year zero kind of thing.
Exactly. But our deep dive today suggests that the true point of origin for the civil wars that unfolded across the post-Soviet space is actually much more recent than you might think.
Yeah, that's one of the most striking insights, I think. The argument is that the real genesis for all post-Soviet civil wars, past, present, and maybe even future ones, actually began in 1989.
1989, Perestroika.
Precisely, the period of Perestroika, a time of supposed openness, reform. But what was really happening, well, you had a society where the Soviet nostalgists, people missing the USSR days, were loudly cursing the partocrats, the party elite.
Okay.
At the same time, miners were striking, demanding, European living standards, and the public was just split right down the middle.
Wow.
Well, between those wanting stability, maybe some moderate reforms, a kind of gradual change, and then the others, the radical reformers, pushing for an immediate bright future, almost overnight.
A utopian vision, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And this moment, this fracturing of society, that's identified as the real genesis of these conflicts.
So it wasn't some ancient historical grievance, or even decisions made mid-century, that really reframes things. We often hear about much older starting points being suggested.
Absolutely. This perspective strongly refutes ideas like the 1955 Khrushchev amnesty being the key. The story that it led to tens of thousands of Bandera supporters returning to Ukraine after collaborating during the war.
Right, I've heard that one.
It's dismissed here as largely a legend, or at least a significant exaggeration of its real impact. And it also argues against other dates, like the 1917 Ukrainization of the old Imperial Army, or the formation of the Central Rada, Ukraine's first parliament.
Or even older.
Yeah, even the 1649's Baruv Treaty, which first sketched out an autonomous Cossack hetmanate, those aren't seen as the true starting points for today's specific conflicts.
Okay, so if those older dates aren't the real roots, why are they dismissed? What makes 1989 so pivotal?
Because, well, while you can always trace history further back, you could go back to the proto-states around Kiev and Novgorod before Oleg even united them.
Sure, you can always go further back.
Right. But the processes that clearly define the conflicts in the geopolitical landscape we see today really kicked off in the late Soviet era. And crucially, these were processes that could have gone differently.
How so?
Think about Perestroika again. It could have perhaps taken the classic Chinese path, building capitalism, but keeping the Communist Party in charge, a one-party system.
Okay, market reforms under party control.
Exactly. And if that had happened, those supposed tens of thousands of Bandera supporters released by Khrushchev, they would have played basically no role whatsoever in shaping Ukraine's future or the region's. Their influence was, in reality, quite minimal.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's dig into that Bandera legend you mentioned. What about the actual impact, the actual whereabouts of those amnestied individuals?
Well, it's clear that while a Khrushchev amnesty did happen, and yes, it included some Bandera supporters, their actual influence on things in the USSR, or even just the Ukrainian SSR, was negligible. Really small. It wasn't even until after Ukrainian independence that people really figured out where many of these returned individuals had settled.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like there's an example in the Veselkiv district near Kyiv. Voting patterns in just one or two specific precincts were completely different from all the surrounding areas.
Noticeably different.
Strikingly different. And later, it was attributed to a compact settlement of these amnestied individuals living there, which suggests, their numbers weren't huge and their impact was very localized, not tens of thousands reshaping the republic.
And they couldn't even return to their original homes in Western Ukraine. Why not?
Precisely. Many couldn't go back because, frankly, they were intensely disliked there, hated even. They faced real threats of being killed for their past actions, their collaboration.
Wow. So where did they go?
They resettled in other places, like the Kherson region down south. And interestingly, that region then consistently voted differently from the rest of southeastern Ukraine, often aligning more with Kyiv or even western Ukraine.
And that's linked directly to this resettlement.
It seems to be a direct consequence, yeah. The mass resettlement of these individuals who found work there. And they weren't just permitted to settle. Soviet authorities actually kind of encouraged them to settle in those specific areas.
Unpacking Ukrainian nationalism, myth versus reality.
So this naturally raises a big question. If the old guard, the original Bandera supporters, weren't really the driving force behind modern Ukrainian nationalism, what was? And the perspective here is quite compelling, maybe even surprising, about this new ways of nationalism.
It's surprising, definitely. Because we often have a certain image, maybe a stereotype, of who these figures might be. But what seems to emerge challenges that quite a bit. Many key figures aren't what you'd expect, right?
Indeed. Not at all. Take Ola Teenybuk, for instance. Founded the Social National Party of Ukraine, later rebranded it as Svoboda, brought it into parliament.
Yeah.
The only Ukrainian nationalist party to get real state-level influence.
Right. Svoboda became quite prominent.
But his background, turns out he was an active Komsomol member of the Soviet Youth Communist League and a descendant of a communist who apparently benefited quite a bit from the USSR.
That is a surprising trajectory. From Komsomol activist to leading nationalist.
It definitely shows roots deep in the very system he'd later oppose. Then there's the infamous Irina Farian. Her name comes up a lot in discussions about extreme nationalism.
Yes, often portrayed as very hardline.
Labeled sometimes a fierce nationalist witch, apparently so extreme that even other nationalists reportedly disliked her for, compromising their image with her statements.
Okay.
Yet her past. She was once a member of the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And perhaps most startlingly, a leading Russifier in Lviv.
A Russifier in Lviv. That's unexpected.
Very. Actively promoting Russian language and culture in a traditionally strong Ukrainian identity region. The implication seems clear. She's a chief Ukrainizer now, but she was a chief Russifier then. Not out of deep belief, it seems, but maybe more out of a strong desire to serve whatever authority was in power.
Opportunism, then.
It suggests these were opportunists who, if, say, Germany or Britain had gained influence in Ukraine, might just as easily have become Germanizers or Anglophiers, serve the power that be.
This really does challenge that idea of Ukrainian nationalism having these deep, unwavering historical roots going back centuries. Mm-hmm. It sounds much more like a phenomenon shaped by contemporary politics and, opportunism.
Exactly. Look at the timeline. Between 1955, the amnesty year, and 1985, things in Ukraine were considered relatively normal from the Soviet viewpoint. Those supposedly released Bandera supporters, who by 85 would have been very old, many likely deceased, only started having any kind of influence, if at all, after decades of basically lying low.
Right. Their impact seems minimal in that long interim period.
It really reinforces that idea. And to illustrate it further, think about the contrasting fates of Petro Shellist and Leonid Kravchuk. Shellist, first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party in the 60s, pursued a kind of soft Ukrainization.
Soft Ukrainization. What did that entail?
It wasn't about breaking away from the USSR. It was more a calculated move, apparently, to strengthen his own position within the party hierarchy, using Ukrainian identity politics for internal gain.
But it backfired.
Ultimately, yes. He was removed because his colleagues feared exactly that these policies would foster real nationalism and weaken the party's grip on Ukraine.
Okay. And then Kravchuk, who becomes Ukraine's first president. How does his story fit?
Well, Kravchuk, even though he worked in the Central Committee, apparently couldn't rise higher than deputy department head under Sherbitsky, the very powerful first secretary who followed Shellist.
Why not?
Because of what was described as his semi-Bandera past, basically, his childhood background in those specific Western Ukrainian regions. His career only really took off after Sherbetsky died in 1989, just as the old party structures were starting to crumble.
Right when things were changing rapidly.
He rose very quickly then, becoming chairman of the Supreme Soviet and then, of course, first president.
So before Perestroika really hit, there was very little overt nationalism, especially somewhere central like Kyiv. It wasn't really visible on the surface.
Not in a significant way, no. There's a striking example given.
Yeah.
Imagine it's 2014 and someone arrives in Moscow, fences painted yellow and blue everywhere apparently, and nobody really cared, just colors.
Okay.
But in Kyiv, back in 1986 or 87, a simple flower bed planted with yellow and blue flowers would have been immediately ripped out, destroyed, because of its powerful symbolic nationalist meaning back then.
Wow, quite a contrast.
Absolutely. Nationalist events, say, at the Taras Shevchenko Monument, they'd attract maybe 4 or 5 people, like the Soviet dissidents on Red Square, and they'd be promptly arrested.
So very marginal, very suppressed.
Extremely. In fact, it suggested that in Kyiv back then, it was actually easier to encounter Jewish nationalism than Ukrainian nationalism.
Yeah.
People apparently supported Golda Meir more readily than figures like Perestroika or Bandera, who were barely known outside certain circles.
The Perestroika experiment and its unintended consequences.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how this Perestroika era, which was supposed to be about reform, maybe revitalization, actually became such a profound catalyst for the very conflicts we're seeing now.
It's a huge irony. Moscow's strategy during Perestroika, as it's explained, was to push for enhanced democratization. The idea was, okay, let's support local Democrats against the regional party elites.
The old guard seen as obstacles.
Exactly, obstacles to reform. But the problem was, these local Democrats often turned out to be national Democrats. Their reformist ideas quickly morphed into nationalist aspirations, often pushing towards independence.
And Moscow didn't see this coming, or enabled it.
Well, crucially, these movements were often nurtured, maybe unintentionally, under the roof of the Communist Party itself, and even the special services. Movements like Rook in Ukraine, which became this powerful pro-independence force.
Yes, Rook was very significant.
These simply couldn't have existed, couldn't have gotten off the ground otherwise. Their initial organizers would likely have ended up in Siberia, if not for this sort of implicit, sometimes even explicit, protection from parts of the system itself.
So the Soviet authorities, trying to reform, kind of inadvertently created the very forces that would tear the Union apart. That's quite something.
It really is. You can see the contrast clearly if you compare the mood in Belarus and Ukraine around 1989, 1990. Belarus was seen then as the locomotive of Perestroika, really embracing reforms. Ukraine, viewed as a preserve of stagnation, much more resistant.
Interesting.
And a powerful illustration comes from August 1991, during the coup attempt in Moscow.
Yeah.
We know there were barricades, protests in Moscow.
Right, a real crisis.
But in Kyiv, when General Voronnikov told Kravchuk, who was then chairman of the Supreme Soviet, that troops would enter the city, Kravchuk apparently just said, "No need. We have complete quiet and peace here. No one opposes the State Committee on the State of Emergency."
He just focused on the harvest.
Focused on the harvest. Seemingly unbothered by the political earthquake, no Bandera supporters trying to stop tanks. Ukraine, it seemed, was still sort of ready to just obey whatever Moscow decided. It shows how much inertia was still there.
So this current wave of Ukrainian nationalism, then, it really isn't some historical revival, like old forces reemerging. It feels like a newer phenomenon born from different circumstances entirely.
Yes, that's a crucial point. This new nationalist growth is not made up of those old Bandera supporters. They were largely gone or very old by then. Instead, many of these new nationalists are actually Russian-speaking.
Russian-speaking nationalists.
Yes, and often from historically Russian-speaking regions. Think about the Azov Battalion, for example, labeled as Nazi by both Russia and the U.S.
Yeah.
But where did it emerge from? Not Western Ukraine.
Where then?
From Kharkiv, Ukraine's easternmost major city, apart from Donetsk. Just 50 kilometers from Belgorod, a classic Russian city.
That's significant.
It really points towards nationalism being this complex social phenomenon, driven by contemporary dynamics, not just purely by, national or ethnic heritage. And this leads us back to why we talk about civil war rather than just separatist uprisings, because society split so rapidly, so fundamentally during Perestroika.
Okay, let's unpack that split. What were the two main divisions, the fault lines?
There were essentially two distinct visions tearing society apart. On one side, you had people who wanted to build a new prosperity, but slowly, carefully. Abandoning communism, yes, but without a clear, instant blueprint.
Looking west, maybe, but cautiously.
perhaps looking west. Yeah, though the Chinese example wasn't as prominent then, especially right after Tiananmen in '89. These people were thinking carefully. What should we produce? What's the right order for political versus economic reforms? A gradual transition.
Okay, the gradualists. And the other side.
The other side basically declared, why look at anything? We've got the American Constitution. Let's just copy it. Or the French one. Pass their laws and boom, tomorrow, or maybe even yesterday, we'll be just like them.
Instant transformation. Just adopt the model.
A lot of people genuinely believe that they just needed to ape the West and instant prosperity would follow, like flipping a switch. What seems to have happened is that Soviet society, closed off for so long, suppressing independent thought, it almost got, poisoned by freedom of thought when the lid suddenly came off.
Overwhelmed by choice.
Totally overwhelmed. People weren't used to choosing, and suddenly they were bombarded with 10 truths, 20 truths, 30 truths, pick one. This kind of intellectual and ideological free-for-all caused this deep societal split, and that's when you saw all sorts of movements pop up, monarchists, fascists, nationalists, all across the USSR.
So even with all these new, sometimes pretty radical movements appearing, the majority of people still didn't actually want the Soviet Union to completely collapse.
That seems right. Even in the Baltics, where independent sentiment was strongest, outright separatists weren't necessarily the majority at first. They often had to work with local Russians, even some communists, to get things done.
So the main divide wasn't purely separatist versus unionist.
The general lines were really these two approaches. Gentle, gradual reform versus a radical, almost civil war in reverse approach. Change everything now, violently if necessary. And sadly, the latter eventually won out.
Why? Why did the radical approach prevail?
Well, there was arguably almost a century of conditioning where radical action was glorified. Think about Soviet history. The heroes were often those who took a Mauser and went to kill enemies of the people. Practical, measured approaches were often dismissed as, Philistine bourgeois.
So that mindset carried over.
It seems it did. The abstract idea of communism was just replaced by an equally abstract and often aggressive idea of anti-communism. And the architects of post-Perestroika Russia, like Chubais and Gaidar, they apparently knew exactly what they were doing. They openly admitted orchestrating this mass predatory privatization.
Selling off state assets rapidly.
Yes, often at rock-bottom prices, benefiting insiders, creating oligarchs overnight. They did this, often damaging state and society, with one main goal: to prevent any possibility of communism returning even a Chinese-style market economy under party rule. Just throw the country into wild capitalism, make it irreversible.
And the public, despite the obvious risks,
Yep.
they bought into this, believed the promises.
Yeah, largely. People were promised these privatization vouchers, famously supposed to be worth 10,000 rubles, enough for a Volga car, was the myth.
Right, the Volga voucher.
Many genuinely believed they would become billionaires, not end up struggling under a bridge. This widespread, maybe naive belief in instant wealth-fueled support for these radical ideas and ultimately led to the country splitting so deeply. I remember talking to fellow students back then saying, look, specialists will always be needed, whatever the system. But many others, caught up in the revolutionary fervor, seemed convinced they'd be the instant millionaires. They overlooked the downsides. The belief was strong, though. And what's really fascinating is, if the collapse had only been about separatism, you'd expect wars mainly between the republics and Moscow, right? Periphery versus center.
That makes sense.
But that's not what happened. The center, Moscow, actually seemed glad to let the republics go, even pushed some out. Instead, what erupted were civil wars within these newly independent countries.
Within Georgia, Moldova.
Within Russia itself, Chechnya, the 1993 Moscow conflict. And critically, within Ukraine. Only Central Asia saw mainly border or water disputes, but even Tajikistan had a brutal, decade-long internal civil war.
And the current conflict in Ukraine.
Viewed through this lens, it's fundamentally a civil war, too. Not purely ethnic. A huge portion of the Ukrainian army speaks Russian. It's seen as the direct result, the culmination, of that choice made during Perestroika. The clash between those wanting to build slowly with their own strength versus those who wanted everything yesterday, relying on the West to magically make things like Germany or America overnight.
Ukraine's Maidan moments, a decisive turn.
Okay, let's shift focus specifically to Ukraine and the pivotal Maidan events. Many people probably think first of the 2014 Euromaidan, but there was an earlier, crucial, and ultimately failed attempt back in 2001, wasn't there?
Absolutely. The Ukraine Without Kuchma protests in 2001 are identified as the very first real attempt at a Maidan. And crucially, then President Kuchma managed to suppress it and without bloodshed.
Which is a stark contrast to what happened later.
A huge contrast to the continuous bloodshed since 2014. It really highlights that maybe it wasn't what President Yanukovych wanted in 2014 that mattered, but the grim outcome he got the blood flowing because he failed, arguably, to fulfill his presidential duties effectively.
So why could Kuchma handle it so easily in 2001? What was different then?
Well, back then, the Ukrainian elite was still largely consolidated around Kuchma. He was in his second term. Ukraine was still, relatively speaking, one of the richer former Soviet republics, and Kuchma was seen as the creator of the Ukrainian oligarchy.
He controlled the purse strings, essentially.
He still had immense resources to distribute. He basically decided who got to be an oligarch and how much they got. So the elite was mostly satisfied. Only a minority, maybe too ambitious or too greedy, really wanted fundamental change.
So he had elite backing.
Broad elite support, yeah. So after the initial shock of the protests, the authorities used their power decisively. When members of UNSO, that ultra-nationalist group, led a crowd trying to storm the presidential administration,
What happened?
they were met with force. Beaten, arrested, sentenced. They served time until 2004 or even later. Power was still consolidated back then, still capable of pushing back effectively.
Okay, so what changed so dramatically by 2004, leading to the Orange Revolution, the Maidan that did succeed?
By 2004, Kuchma and his chief of staff, Viktor Medvedchuk, were apparently implementing this too clever plan. They knew the Americans were backing Viktor Yushchenko for president and probably preparing for Maidan-style protests.
They anticipated it.
They did. Kuchma had even got permission from the Constitutional Court for a third term, but publicly said he wouldn't run. Then, when the protests erupted against the officially elected President Yanukovych, and the country really looked like it might split east-west, Kuchma just kind of removed himself.
Step back.
Totally. He basically told President Yanukovych, you deal with it. Even though President Yanukovych rightly pointed out, hey, you're still president until the inauguration, you can't just abdicate responsibility now.
So a critical power vacuum opened up right at the decisive moment.
Precisely. A leadership void. The police, apparently, were ready to disperse the Maidan, which, ironically, seems to have had even more initial public support than the later Euromaidan in 2014.
Really? More support?
Paradoxically, yes, but there was no clear command given. Kuchma's gamble, it seems, was that Yushchenko and President Yanukovych would politically destroy each other, create chaos.
And then he could step in.
Step back in as the savior, forced to run for a third term because people crave stability. But what they crucially overlooked, or underestimated, was the role of the U.S. as a major player in Ukrainian internal politics.
Right, the external influence factor.
Huge factor.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court initially ruled the election results couldn't be accurately determined. Now, constitutionally, that should have meant entirely new elections, new candidates excluding both Yushchenko and President Yanukovych.
Which would have fit Kuchma's plan perfectly.
Exactly. But then, apparently at the clear urging of the Americans, the Supreme Court did something unconstitutional. It declared a third round or repeat second round specifically between Yushchenko and President Yanukovych.
That basically changed the game.
It effectively legitimized a state coup, paving the way for Yushchenko to eventually win. By 2004, unlike 2001, the Ukrainian elites were already fractured. If Kuchma had been decisive, maybe he could have held on, like Russian President Lukashenko did in Belarus later. But he wasn't.
Okay, so that sets the stage for 2014. What about President Yanukovych's performance then? The analysis seems pretty critical of his actions, or maybe his inaction.
Yeah, there seems to be a consistent pattern highlighted. President Yanukovych repeatedly failing to assert authority when challenged, like back in 2007.
What happened in 2007?
Yushchenko, then president, issued an unconstitutional decree dissolving parliament. He even ordered internal troops towards Kyiv, seemingly trying to provoke a civil conflict. It failed, but still.
What could Yanukovych have done?
Well, President Yanukovych, as prime minister then, arguably had the constitutional grounds, plus the support of the Constitutional Court, the Prosecutor General, even key security forces Interior Ministry backed him. Their army was neutral to have Yushchenko arrested.
But he didn't.
No, he agreed to new elections instead. Apparently thinking his party would just win them easily. They lost.
So by 2014, there was this history. He was perhaps seen by key players, like the U.S., as someone who would ultimately fold under pressure, a known quantity in terms of backing down.
It seems the Americans were indeed confident he'd surrender his position again, just like he arguably did in 2004 and 2007. So in 2013-2014, President Yanukovych tried a different tactic.
What was that?
The outwaiting strategy. Surround the Maidan protests with police, contain them, and just wait for them to fizzle out, burn themselves out. But that strategy, waiting it out, it really only works if you have absolute rock-solid support from your political elite and from society, like Orban had when he suppressed protests in Hungary.
Which Yanukovych didn't have.
Not really. When society and the elites are split like they were in Ukraine, waiting just makes your own supporters nervous. They start to waver. Unstable elements defect. The opposition gets stronger. Eventually, you're left with only two choices. Use overwhelming force, much more than just batons, or flee.
And President Yanukovych chose to flee.
He chose to flee. It's suggested that if he had used decisive force back in February 2014, maybe he could have won, theoretically. But it would have meant serious bloodshed by then, because the moments for a peaceful resolution back in December 2013 had already passed. He'd missed those windows.
So his claim, the one he often repeated about not wanting bloodshed, it ultimately rings hollow, given the catastrophic outcome.
The argument presented is that it doesn't really matter what President Yanukovych wanted. What matters is the result he got. And the blood flowed precisely because he failed to fulfill his presidential duties. He missed the moments to handle the Maidan peacefully in late 2013.
By making the wrong bet.
Making the wrong bet that it would just tire itself out behind police lines. He fundamentally failed to grasp, it seems, that he wasn't just fighting his domestic opposition, he was up against the U.S. And when you confront a superpower, you need decisive action and absolutely solid internal support. If you wait, they'll, well, eat you, as the saying goes.
A hard lesson.
And it's argued that many in Ukraine failed, and maybe continue to fail, to understand this crucial dynamic. And that misunderstanding has led to many of the country's problems.
The current conflict, a chapter in a larger confrontation.
This detailed look at Ukraine's internal struggles, the Maidan moments, the external influences, it brings us right up to the current conflict. Yeah. And there's a significant distinction made here. Referring to it as a special military operation, or SVO, is seen as useful. Why? Because it helps separate the events happening within Ukraine from what's framed as a much older, ongoing war.
Right, an ongoing war between Russia and the collective West.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is the assertion that this larger, more fundamental conflict didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2022, or even in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea or the Donbass war starting.
No, the roots go further back. Its first real battles, or at least very clear signals of this confrontation, are identified as way back in 1999.
1999, what happened then?
Two key events. First, Russian Prime Minister Primakov's plane famously turning around mid-flight over the Atlantic. He was heading to the U.S., but turned back in protest against NATO bombing Yugoslavia.
A major diplomatic snub.
A huge statement. And second, the daring dash by Russian paratroopers to Pristina Airport in Kosovo, also in '99, basically racing NATO forces to secure it first.
Okay, so early challenges to the post-Cold War order.
Seen as direct challenges to a unipolar world dominated by the U.S., absolutely.
So the current SVO, then, is understood as just one major battle, albeit a very significant one, within this much larger, decades-long geopolitical confrontation, stretching far beyond Ukraine itself.
Precisely. That's the framework. And within that framework, the worst-case scenario is defined as the U.S. and NATO escalating things further.
How so? Escalating how?
By expanding the conflict zone, its geography and its depth, its intensity, which could potentially turn the SVO into a full-blown European war. And from there, the terrifying potential is for it to become a global conflict.
That's a grim possibility.
It is. And the U.S. is seen as consistently pushing those limits of escalation, trying to involve NATO more deeply, but maybe without direct U.S. boots on the ground initially, because Ukraine alone is apparently no longer seen as sufficient to achieve U.S. strategic objectives.
But why is it proving difficult for the U.S. to get other NATO countries fully on board with this kind of major escalation? What's the hesitation?
Well, other NATO countries, many of which might have been more gung-ho, say, a year or two ago, are now looking at Ukraine's situation as a pretty stark warning. A cautionary tale.
Reality is setting in.
Reality is definitely setting in. If there aren't enough weapons or shells for Ukraine, it's becoming painfully clear there won't be enough for them either in a direct fight. And crucially, the belief that someone, namely the U.S., would automatically jump in to fight Russia directly on their behalf is eroding.
So they're becoming more wary.
They're wary, yes. Despite this, the assessment is that the U.S. hasn't actually abandoned this dangerous idea of expansion and escalation. And that path is seen as the most perilous one, potentially leading to an uncontrolled confrontation.
And the end point of uncontrolled confrontation.
Historically, it's often involved nuclear escalation because, tragically, humanity hasn't invented a more powerful weapon yet to definitively end such large-scale conflicts once they spiral out of control. Which naturally leads to the question, given this dangerous dynamic, what's Russian President Putin's stance? What's the position coming from Moscow on resolving this?
Well, the understanding is that the Russian leadership has repeatedly indicated readiness for some kind of compromise peace.
Yes, Russian leadership constantly emphasizes readiness for a compromise peace. But, and this is a crucial, but it's always explicitly stated that this cannot come at the expense of Russia's core security interests.
Non-negotiable security needs.
Exactly. And it also comes with a very clear warning. Russia will not stop if attempts are made to intimidate it with further escalation. The logic communicated, seemingly for years now, is clear. Escalating further achieves nothing but massive destruction, potentially catastrophic for everyone.
So the call is to talk.
The call from Moscow is negotiate, engage in serious dialogue, consider legitimate security interests mutually, find a way forward that respects fundamental concerns on both sides.
The path forward, navigating a dangerous landscape.
But the primary challenge, it seems, is that Western ruling elites just aren't ready, or perhaps aren't willing, to accept Russia's position, despite these calls for talks.
Why not? Why such resistance to negotiation? Even if the alternative is potentially so destructive, what's driving that?
Well, the argument presented is that they're simply too invested, too tied to their current course. Admitting a geopolitical defeat, basically acknowledging their strategy against Russia hasn't worked, would mean losing political power.
Losing face, losing power.
And maybe not just for a few years, potentially losing power forever, and even facing the risk of criminal prosecution down the line. Why? Because they themselves have often actively persecuted political opponents, and in doing so, have arguably taken actions against their own state's best interests.
So they feel cornered.
It paints a picture of them being in a position where they just aren't ready to accept what might look like Russia's charity, this offer of a compromise peace. It feels like weakness they can't afford. And it's important to clarify what this Russian compromise entails, or rather what it doesn't entail. Russia isn't demanding, for instance, a complete redrawing of the map of Europe in its favor.
Okay. What is it seeking then?
Sufficient security guarantees. And crucially, these guarantees, it stated, must be controlled by Russia itself. Why? Because trust in the West, actually sticking to agreements, has apparently eroded completely.
So verifiable Russia-controlled guarantees.
Yes. Now that's certainly unpleasant for the West, no doubt. But it's not seen as fatal to their security or existence. For example, Russia isn't demanding NATO dissolve or that countries leave NATO. They can remain members. But military infrastructure, that has to be moved far away from Russia's borders.
Pulled back.
Pulled back. Specifically, anything moved beyond the Oder River or deployed after 1997, essentially, reversing NATO expansion into former Warsaw Pact territory, should be withdrawn.
So the West's refusal isn't really about protecting existing borders, per se. It's about deeper strategic goals, goals that go beyond just immediate defense concerns.
Exactly. The assessment is that the West basically staked its whole future on defeating Russia and China. The plan, or hope, was to solve their own deep-seated financial and economic problems using the trophies from that expected victory.
Plunder, essentially.
A form of geopolitical plunder, yes. But since those trophies haven't materialized, the victory hasn't happened, the financial problems back home persist. Internal tensions are rising sharply in Western societies.
And so war becomes.
External war starts to look like a desperate measure. A way to try and consolidate society, unite people against a common enemy, distract from those pressing internal issues. And that creates a very, very dangerous situation. It's also worth noting, perhaps, that within Russian society itself, there might be a bit of euphoria, a sense that victory in Ukraine means everything's solved. But the reality check is, it's a serious, important victory, yes, but maybe not the final, overarching victory in the larger confrontation with the West. That continues. This also brings up the question of internal stability within these Western countries, not just about economics, right?
No, definitely not. We're seeing widespread farmer protests across Europe, major political battles within the EU structure, deep, deep internal divisions in the US. How do all these factors play into the bigger picture?
They're huge factors, those farmer protests, for example. They could end in some kind of compromise, or they could blow up into serious social unrest, depending on how governments handle them.
And political struggles.
Look at Germany. The ruling traffic light coalition, Social Democrats, Greens, Liberals, versus the opposition AfD. Could that lead to an attempt to ban the AfD? Or will the coalition itself collapse? or another messy compromise, nobody knows.
And elsewhere.
Polish-Ukrainian relations are incredibly strained. Internal Polish conflicts are intensifying. You see Polish farmers blocking checkpoints, even roads heading west, showing deep discontent. It all points towards a really complex destabilization of the European Union as a whole system. So European elites face this stark choice. Option 1, quickly reach some kind of agreement with Russia that might give them breathing room, resources both internal and external to try and stabilize things at home.
Option 2.
Option 2, escalate further, use the argument that this terrible enemy, Russia, demands total mobilization, requires everyone to unite, forget internal squabbles. Both paths seem equally possible right now. No final choice has been made, it appears.
And then there's the U.S. The upcoming election just adds another huge layer of uncertainty. U.S. President Trump suggesting U.S. President Biden might not even make it to the election, while U.S. President Biden's supporters are actively trying to stop U.S. President Trump from even running. It's incredibly polarized.
Yeah, the U.S. seems locked in a state of permanent internal division. Now, this split probably isn't going to lead to actual secession anytime soon. The forces holding the country together are likely still stronger than those pulling it apart. But it's a massive factor they always have to consider.
How does it affect foreign policy?
Well, U.S. President Biden's team seems characterized by this drive to escalate international tensions, maybe as a strategy to try and unite Americans against an external threat, right? Classic move. U.S. President Trump's approach, on the other hand, tends to focus more inward, America first, dealing with internal problems.
But even that
fundamentally requires maintaining American global hegemony. You can't really retreat from the world if your whole system relies on being dominant. U.S. President Trump in his first term tried to square this circle, partly by using force, but trying to shift the main focus of confrontation away from Russia and more towards China.
So looking at the whole global picture, it just remains incredibly unstable, volatile, unpredictable, so many powerful, conflicting forces pulling in different directions.
Absolutely. The conclusion drawn is that these conflicting trends often just cancel each other out, making it genuinely impossible to predict with any certainty which one will win out in the end.
So the only option is?
Be prepared for any outcome, literally any, including the worst-case scenarios. That might mean, for instance, facing a conflict with Poland instead of celebrating a victory in Ukraine this summer or fall. Preparedness for anything seems key.
Well, that was truly a deep dive. Unpacking the history, the societal splits, the political calculations, the geopolitical currents. It really makes you think how choices made decades ago, those divisions formed during Perestroika, are still playing out so powerfully today.
It absolutely underscores those profound connections, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between internal society shifts, pivotal political decisions, and these huge international conflicts. The past isn't just history. It's an active force shaping our present reality, shaping the choices we face right now.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear.
New episodes every day.